everybody. Welcome to another episode of Giant Art Reviews. Although I think this is good enough to be a content-minded, actually. We'll see. I'll decide in post. So, this is another paid film review. My usual fee is $100. And if you want me to review a movie, it has to be a real movie. Longer things like a series within reason, a book, that would require more than $100 because of the time and effort. But for a film, an actual film, nothing like a Korn movie, if you know what I mean, or something ridiculous. It has to have some kind of content I could review and talk about. Although I have reviewed what people have considered slops, such as both Legally Blondes, for example. But this is the review of 2001, A Space Odyssey. I don't know how I'm going to do this besides not really dwelling on reviewing the movie as... Well, okay, it is reviewing the movie as a whole. But it's very difficult. I'll get into that. So please like, share, and subscribe. Click the bell. That's the click noise. I have to learn how to edit that. When they go the dun-dun, click the bell, right? That's what all the YouTubers are doing nowadays. And if you want me to review something, please mention in a comment. You can email me. My email is linked in my Linktree. Or you can contact me. Or you can even tweet at me and I'll DM you on Twitter. And everyone knows my Twitter. So anyways, if you have a movie idea for me to review, I'm very open to this. So anyways, 2001 A Space Odyssey, I watched it. I think the first time I watched it, I was like 12 years old. I watched it with my old man. And of course, I didn't really get a lot of the subtext. I think it nodded off partway through it. And then whatever. Then I watched it again when I was older, in my 20s. Although now I'm in my 30s, so... Well, 2001 A Space Odyssey, I always debate, what is my favorite Kubrick film? 2001 is, of course, a great contender. Although I think in terms of entertainment value, I tend to lean towards Full Metal Jacket. The first 20 minutes I've memorized off... I remember at one point I memorized all of Sergeant Hartman's dialogue that he came up with. Well... He sort of kind of came up with it. It was from a letter from a drill sergeant, but he came up with a lot of it. They let him call it in the ring, if you know what I mean. But I believe the basic nuts and bolts, or the skeleton of his lines, were formulated by, I believe, a combination of Stanley Kubrick himself, but also Michael Herr, who wrote the famous Vietnam book Dispatches. Where he actually was a journalist that was in Vietnam. But anyways, if you want me to review Full Metal Jacket, that's, But Full Metal Jacket will come up. But anyways, 2001 A Space Odyssey, literally everybody under the sun for decades and decades has reviewed this film. So I'm not going to, really go into, the nitty-gritty of plot details, although I will go into some. But I wanted to just... This is why I put off this review. Because... It's very difficult to talk about 2001 because everybody has talked about 2001. But I think for me, what really is important is the overarching mythological theme, but also the debate as to what is that mythological theme. It's pretty clear what it is, but in terms of its disposition towards the Western canon or even the Eastern canon in general. And because this is, I think, the problem, is that artists are, and as an artist myself, artists are not exactly philosophers or theologians. Although the muse commands that art is driven by a lot of what the philosopher and the theologian is driven towards. So it's very difficult to place a very clear and concise narrative. Because when I'm podcasting or when I'm writing, you have to, I paint, I think, in a similar manner. For example, I'm trying to get different influences here and there. It's like, for example, my very good friend Zach Brown, who is way more skilled as a painter than I am. He said, sometimes I don't really think about it. It's like the muse shows me an image or shows me a concept, and it's there. When I'm going out and I'm doing plein air painting outdoors, I see a piece of the landscape, and I see it, and it catches my eye, and it compels me in a weird way. And some instances I go back over and over and over again. Even if those landscape paintings and those sketches, if you will, done plein air, even if they're just one little piece of a grander painting that has narrative, that's driven towards something else. It's like it compels you towards something. And I think Stanley Kubrick operated in much the same manner. I think that this is the problem with philosophically, politically, and theologically dissecting a work of art as a critic, is that an artist does not operate in the same parameters as a political scientist or a theologian or a philosopher does. Things are left to ambiguity. Now, in certain forms of philosophy, of course, a lot of things are left to ambiguity. Especially nowadays, if you read Laurel or, well, even to an extent, I wouldn't say Derrida, but if you read even the philosopher as social commentator of the internet age, such as Byung-Chul Han, there's a lot of, he's dipping into it and pulling back out in very short chapters. It's like the artist does that. The artist does not write a long philosophic treatise, but rather dips their toes into it, bathes in it, works around a little bit, wades in the waters, and then goes out. On to the next piece of art. On to the next painting, on to the next novel, and in Stanley Kubrick's case, on to the next film. Right? Now, in terms of filmmaking, Stanley Kubrick, of course, lends to a form of systematization with his film. He's maybe not plagued by very concise themes. For example, Adam McGowan has very concise themes in every single film that he does. But there are themes and overarching motifs nevertheless. So in that way, Stanley Kubrick is, for example, I would say on par with a metaphysical painter. I would say on par with metaphysical filmmaking of, say, Tarkovsky. Although I think Tarkovsky, maybe it's just the impression by a fan base, by the way that the culture industry has appropriated Stanley Kubrick. But I would say that Tarkovsky lends towards cinephiles and people that are more intellectually serious and people that are willing to wade through very long and sloggy metaphysical films. Whereas Stanley Kubrick is more of the everyman version of a deep philosophic, I would say, metaphysical filmmaker. To where you have utterly ridiculous slop. Like that Spielbergo film that I was forced to watch because my editor at the time in a magazine I was writing for wanted me to review it. That stupid Ready Player One film. And of course, the crescendo is the film, they're back at Stanley Kubrick's hotel from The Shining, The Shinning. And it's very funny because Spielbergo, it's almost like he artistically cucked himself in the same way as anyone who is paying an homage, but that homage has a certain level of envy to it. Where it's I think even the character said something, the main character in Ready Player One, where it's Spielberg talking about himself of oh man, I could never be that great of a filmmaker like Kubrick. People say, oh, actually, if you look at the more obscure works from Spielberg, he's actually a great filmmaker. Who cares? I don't care. Because you cannot compare Stanley Kubrick. You cannot compare a work like 2001: A Space Odyssey to E.T. or whatever, right? I know I'm being disingenuous. For example, there was that one war film, not Saving Private Ryan, but there was a Japanese one where Spielberg was trying to become more deep and meaningful and nuanced. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. So Stanley Kubrick, he dips his toes into the philosophic, into the theological, into the metaphysical, and then he goes back out. And so it's very hard. And so this is all leading up to my number one, not number one, but rather my first point about 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is this interplay between its influences upon the Western metaphysical and even Eastern traditions and the various elements of it that was inspired by Kubrick's reading of Friedrich Nietzsche, in particular Zarathustra. Whereas a lot of those themes, you could see it as more evidenced in Full Metal Jacket, certainly. Especially the way that Jung talks about Nietzsche. Because that's what the filter is. Carl Jung and Mircea Eliade is the lens by which you get this element of Nietzscheanism, or rather specifically this element of Thus Sparked Zarathustra in 2001: A Space Odyssey. But there's that debate. Because if it's being mediated by technology and by superior beings in space, is it more in keeping with a purely metaphysical film or a mystical piece of art in filmmaking? Or, and this is the debate, does he keep towards more of the interpretation of Zarathustra? That it is of the earth, it is eminentized, it is of the material reality, which I will explain in regards to the film and in regards to Zarathustra. And it's actually very funny that I'm doing this now, because in a synchronous sort of way, because I'm actually doing a painting series of 6 major paintings on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. So, anyway, so let me get into a little bit of that debate. And I think before we get into it, a way of opening up this question. Now, I have many more observations about 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I think I want to mine this Nietzschean vein. And the clearest insight into the Nietzschean element of 2001: A Space Odyssey is the opening soundtrack, is the symphony that was inspired by Nietzsche's Zarathustra. We all know the famous one, right? The Child in Space. I mean, that is very clearly an homage to Friedrich Nietzsche in Zarathustra. Because what is the celestial being that is reborn in the French room? In the French, what is it, 17th century room? That these higher beings, out in space, that have captured Dr. Bowman to study him. He becomes old. He goes through the cycle of life, expiring, rebirth, age. Now, of course, Arthur C. Clarke was greatly inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche, who originally wrote the story. So, what comes out the other end? At the very end of the film, the child, the cosmic child, the baby in the womb of space, in utero, about to be reborn. A new being for a new cosmic humanity. Now, what is the main protagonist in Zarathustra? In Nietzsche's Zarathustra? Because it is Zarathustra himself, but it is the coming child. A child that does not have the consciousness of our previous world, of the bad faith, of the flies at the marketplace. The child that is infinite growth, or what Nietzsche calls in Zarathustra, the philosophers of the future, that will come and overcome this current iteration of humanity. But the difference being is that, as opposed to the metaphoric language of Zarathustra, because you have to remember, this is very important, this is Philosophy 101 right here. This is Nietzsche 101, I should say. Although you need to be in some grad course to understand this nowadays. Because God forbid, undergrads, if you expose them to Nietzsche, they go crazy. One of my professors was actually a Nietzsche expert that said this once. So what is the main theme in Zarathustra? It is the overcoming of the previous bricklage of the metaphysical system of the West, the Western world. Now, people have tried to read parallels into Eastern philosophy and so forth, but for the scope of 2001: A Space Odyssey, what 2001 does, which a lot of great works of art do when it comes to philosophic and theological themes, is that unlike the metaphoric language of Zarathustra, the coming child of the future, the philosophers of the future, man self-overcoming, the tightrope walker, is the attempt to overcome oneself, but ends in failure. The only one who mourned for the sunsetting, to use YouTube language, the sunsetting of the tightrope walker in the first chapter of Zarathustra, is Zarathustra himself is the only one that mourns because he sees something greater. But unlike the sort of metaphoric and allegorical language, because Zarathustra is in many ways a subversion of the Christian mystical story. It is a reverse polarity of it. It goes towards the earth rather than towards the heavens. Because everything, liberation and salvation of man is experienced in nature, in natura, rather than in the metaphysical. That is the key lesson of Zarathustra. But what 2001: A Space Odyssey does as a metaphysical film is it concretizes in living form, through picture, through celluloid, through film. In the work of art, it concretizes those themes. Now it makes it a metaphor of science fiction. And it shows you, in a very lively manner, what those allegories and those parables in that inversion of the Christian hagiographic story, it shows you man in the future, or what Stanley Kubrick interpreted as the coming future. Now notice how 2001 is the year. It is the coming of a new millennia. Now, of course, our world looks very different than what was imagined in the 1960s in works like Star Trek and in Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, but nevertheless. So what the work of art does, especially this film, is it gives a concrete narrative form to those allegories of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. But what it does is because Kubrick is an artist, so he's not going to remain totally faithful to the metaphysical, or rather lack of metaphysical priors that Nietzsche has. Because I believe Arthur C. Clarke was also an atheist. He had this I remember even in first year philosophy, we read these thought probe parables, and Arthur C. Clarke had this, I would say, fedora tipping story about the Star of Bethlehem annihilating a whole civilization, but it gave birth to God. It was that one, the star, right? It's very fedora tippy, but whatever, who cares? Nevertheless, what this film does is it won't remain faithful to that strictly, eminentized, materialist, faithful to the earth interpretation, in some ways a weird conglomeration of elan vital or life energy, but there's no metaphysical distinction. It's because, again, Nietzsche is very inspired by people like Spinoza. Everything is of this world. Everything is eminentized. There is no metaphysical distinction. Nietzsche overturns the tables of Western metaphysics, that there is a phenomenal and noumenal distinction, or there is a form in particular that goes all the way back to Plato and even back to the pre-Socratics, that was then galvanized in Christianity, according to Friedrich Nietzsche. So, Arthur C. Clarke, Stanley Kubrick does not remain faithful to that interpretation, I would argue, because a lot of elements, even though it is sci-fi, it's hard sci-fi, there's technology, but is it really quote-unquote hard sci-fi? Because in a lot of ways, whether it's the beings out in space or it's the monolith itself, there's a lot of things that return back to that Western metaphysical, I would even say Christian tradition, that you would find that runs contrary to the message of what Nietzsche was trying to accomplish with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I think you have to be comfortable with a lot of those contradictions in order to truly appreciate a metaphysical film or any piece of art like that, like 2001: A Space Odyssey. So a way of illustrating this, let me read you a quote from Carl Jung's seminars on Nietzsche's Zarathustra that I think is very applicable to 2001: A Space Odyssey, or rather the future that Kubrick is envisioning with 2001. So here we go. And keep in mind later on, I want to read an essay. Maybe I'll have to paywall it. I'll read an essay by an academic that's writing about Mircea Eliade, the great mythologist and perennialist philosopher, in regard to 2001: A Space Odyssey. But here we go. Here's the quote by Carl Jung. This is from his seminars on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which I have an abridged copy of. I was going to buy a full copy once, but the seller screwed me over on Amazon. I was so pissed. I was willing to drop, I think, like $150 or something on it. It's how rare this is. But I do have the abridged version, so here we go. I am reading now. So here he says on seminars on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and I believe this comes from, well, it was given in 1934 to 1939, and this is near the end, so page 100, page 1108, or whereabouts. For instance, let us assume you live in a time when the static principle is ruling. There you will find mystics. The mystics themselves are then the ones who are supposed or are suppressed by the static principle. And they begin to boil, to move with no clear ideas, but they move, they are alive. It is typical for the mystics that they live. Their most characteristic quality is in the intensity of their life form, or their lives counts with them. They are a reaction against the static principle. But in a time when mysticism is really living, as it is now, movement prevails. We live in such a period, and we are looking for a static system in which to find peace, and we are going to create one, for after a time of turmoil, we are longing for rest, for sleep, even for a kind of suffocation after that eternal boiling and vibrating. You see, it is always a question of one-sidedness. When the static principle goes too far, there will be an uprush or a dynamic movement. Or if you have the contrary, then there will create a compensation. This is the mechanism in the chapter, is a piece of life, which again he's referring to Nietzsche's Zarathustra. So it's crucial that you understand what Jung means by the static principle. If you read the archetypes of the collective unconscious, what he means is that the archetypes themselves have a stability throughout time and place and throughout various civilizations that graft onto them or use them, what John David Ebert would call the econotypes that are expressed in the work of art, for example. The econotypes that create the world picture of a civilization. And of course, John David Ebert in his book, Art After Metaphysics, he's combining Jung along with Oswald Spengler to have a very cyclical view of civilization and creation itself. Much like the cyclical view, but I'm going to get to that, in 2001: A Space Odyssey, when it comes to Kubrick being inspired by Nietzsche's concept in Zarathustra, in The Joyous Science of the Eternal Return. So the static principle means that throughout time and space and throughout civilizations, the archetypes have a form of transhistoricalness. They are static. But this static nature can become sort of overbearing. But what is dynamic is the individual process of what Jung calls individuation. That is singularized or becomes the process of individuation for a civilization or a people or a nation as a whole. Because they can also have this collective process of coming into them, similar to what Oswald Spengler talks about in Decline of the West, how a people comes into a culture, right? So even really quickly, the static principle in Jungian psychology, understood in several ways, but most directly relates to the concept of the collective unconscious and its contents, the archetypes, while Jung acknowledged the dynamic and ever-evolving nature of the psyche, also posits that certain fundamental patterns and images, the econotypes and the archetypes, the econotypes being those images and symbols of a civilization, of something that dwells deep within the human spirit. The archetypes are inherently relative and stable across generations and cultures. These archetypes, while not fixed in their manifestations, represent universal human experiences and predispositions, but individuation is a dynamic process. So Dr. Bowman goes through a process of individuation in 2001: The Space Odyssey. but he manifests in different human forms by his age, but then ultimately his age and then going through that process of death and rebirth becomes the cosmic child. And then the cycle starts all over again. And of course, the Harbinger, which I'll get into maybe later on, maybe in the paywalled version, the Harbinger of all of this is the Monolith. The Monolith is the catalyst. It is the threshold of transformation. Did anyone get that reference? It's reference to the band Isis. One of my favorite songs ever is called Threshold of Transformation, off of Wavering Radiant. By the way, the album Wavering Radiant, that's a tongue tie. Wavering Radiant is a very Jungian-inspired album. Like how me and Matthew the Stout, it's on my channel on Style Talks. If you search on my channel Style Talks, me and Matthew the Stout, we review the whole album by Isis, Panopticon, which is inspired by Michel Foucault. So, but Wavering Radiant is inspired by Carl Jung. Maybe one day me and Matthew will both, we'll both review it. So this is what he's saying, though. What Jung is saying here is that the static principle then becomes something overbearing, and then civilization gears towards another thing, right? So, but then of course the role of the mystic is integral to this process as well. So when he says that our time of turmoil, they live their most characteristic qualities, the intensity of their lives. But then when you have a civilization or a moment within civilization that is geared towards movement and dynamism, or geared towards tumultuous dynamism, similar to when Jung was writing that. So here is an article by Depth Insights, so it's another one on depth psychology and psychoanalysis relating to the lectures in Zarathustra, where Jung was introduced to Zarathustra by Gross. His fascination with Nietzsche's concept of the Dionysian and the letter he wrote to Freud, this period suddenly rose in 1909. It's very funny how, like, when you really think about it, Freud, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche were like, I guess Albert Einstein. They're like the four horsemen of the apocalypse in the 19th century for like overturning Western civilization as a whole. There's a very good rant about that, which I cannot get into, by a very amazing Ryan Gosling movie. But I don't think I should mention the name or go any further with the thought. But while Nietzsche's not of this group, but like Nietzsche certainly was in terms of philosophy, Freud in terms of psychoanalysis, and the picture of the psyche related to infantile actuality, if you know what I mean, theoretical physics, and of course class warfare. But well, anyways, that's neither here nor there. But but when you really think about it, though, it actually does relate to 2001: A Space Odyssey, because this is like a side note. I'll get back to this thing about the archetypes and the static principle. Here's a little side note. A lot of sci-fi, to which I think Star Trek is one of the most guilty of this, although there was like a cosmic war, there was the reign of Khan, but then you have like other like more, let's say, kid-friendly versions of like soft sci-fi, such as Adventure Time. I hated the last season. I didn't even watch the last season of Adventure Time, but let's say the first few seasons, very similar vibe to, say, Ursula K. Le Guin, what is called, quote-unquote, soft science fiction. But a lot of science fiction, especially the god-awful stuff written by sci-fi authors nowadays, it's like all that transformation of civilization, that's sort of like an afterthought. That's like not important. It's like, it's almost like fantasy writing. It's like what's really important is the world building and this like Baroque terminology and all the, players. And it's like the actual getting there to that stage in development. It's like, that's not important. But the actual getting there to a truly cosmic future, to which humanity does not confront merely a technological singularity, but in this instance, a spiritual singularity, which again grates with the purely Nietzschean interpretation of 2001, because Nietzsche is of the earth. There is no transcendence. There is only the transcendence of human will. There's a transcendence of humanity as such. But then even in Zarathustra, you get a little bit of an inkling of the metaphysical here and there, such as when Zarathustra talks about wild wisdom, and people question even the most vicious attacks on Christianity in particular, and the Western metaphysical tradition, by Nietzsche in works like Twilight of Idols. Because the various statements of Nietzsche about Christ in particular, he says, well, yeah, Christ is an overman. Christ overcame the Roman Empire. Christ overcame the other civilization that Christianity originated from as well. I don't know what I could say for YouTube, but you know what I mean. So it's very interesting, because Zarathustra does come off, even though the message is of the earth, the message is of our time, the message is of an eminent temporality, of man overcoming man. Not man in grace and transcendence with the divine, but man creating himself in his own image, with his own values, as a god in his own image. But even still, you have little inklings here and there of the beyond. But in 2001, The Space Odyssey, you don't have merely a technological singularity. Like, Hall is the best example. Hall is like the R-Ax, Nick Land, AI going crazy. But what you have at the furthest reaches of the known universe in this picture of humanity is man confronting semi-divine beings. Are they aliens? Are they technology? Who knows? But to us, they are divine beings. They are maybe like third or fourth order civilization, whereas we are in first order species civilization. So if you are in the next level, you could see the future. You can manipulate matter. You could see temporality if you're on another plane of existence, on another life world, rather than our own, where temporality has, time and space have very fixed rules. But what if you can bend those rules? They would be like gods to us. Goddesses or whatever. But, so Stanley Kubrick, it's not merely just the technology. A lot of these nerds that review sci-fi, they just focus on that. They focus on the paradox of Hall, and why did Hall go crazy? Because the real mission is to explore the monolith, and it's like, but Hall had to hide it from them, and he couldn't compute. Sort of like that one episode of the Star Trek original series, where the robots, Kirk and all of them, they tricked them by giving them logic paradoxes that didn't make any sense. Sort of like that, right? So you have a sort of reversal of that. You don't have a technological singularity. You are going right back to the metaphysics. But the reason I say that 2001 is not like other sci-fi masterpieces. It's not like Foundation series. Because Isaac Asimov was the nerdiest of nerds. He was fedora tip maxing, and it's all about science, and it's got to be hard science fiction, and it's got to have this logical explanation. The beginning of 2001 gives you the birth of consciousness. And what is the birth of consciousness? It is something that is not just merely a divine revelation. It is not Edenic in any way. It is violent. It is terrible. It is Cain picking up did he stab his brother? He clubbed him. It's Cain picking up the club against his own brother Abel. That is the beginning of consciousness. Consciousness is the beginning of the friend-enemy distinction. So, what is another influence here? Really briefly, I'm not a Hegelian, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But maybe one day I'll bring on a Hegelian on the show. But what is the beginning for both Schmidt and Hobbes and Friedrich Hegel? Is that violent confrontation with the other. The other is the only guarantee of the I consciousness, of the individual principle, of the self. The I can only be an I with the other. but in a violent confrontation with the other. So this is Hegel's master and slave. The master overcomes the slave in combat. He is a superior being. But in overcoming, the master realizes that his own self-image, his own dialectical process of self and other can only be real with the slave. So in 2001, unlike most sci-fi, gives you the very primitive outreaches of humanity, the very beginning stages, in that confrontation of self and other, friend, enemy. And then from there, you see the development of technology. You have a better club and a better spear. It's like, someday they'll build a bigger board with a bigger nail, and they'll create such a large board and nail that they'll destroy themselves. That's a little Simpsons reference right there. If you remember, King Kodos was chased away by Mo with a board with a nail on a board. Very funny. That's when Simpsons was good, actually, not nowadays. But so you have this violent confrontation with self and other, that the monkeys are the beginning. But all of this, the birth of technics, the birth of technology, or rather the res extensa of technology, because the club becomes an integral tool in my hand. You become the awareness of tool work, the awareness of techniques themselves. You have that, and then you speed run, you jump all the way to a cosmic, advanced, spacefaring, traveling, global civilization. So Kubrick grounds 2001 in this awareness. But what brings about that awareness, which I'm going to talk about later on, it is the monolith. It is the manifestation of the collective unconscious. It is the harbinger or catalyst, the threshold of transformation of consciousness itself. That is the monolith. And people make memes about it, and all these sci-fi nerds talk about the monolith and blah, blah, blah. But they don't realize the real spiritual implications of that. They think that, oh, wow, the monolith must be some piece of technology. It must be like some AI port that like told primitive, early hominids to develop tool work, to develop techniques. But is it really a piece of technology? I don't think Stanley Kubrick meant it to be just a piece of technology. If you look at that clip, that interview before he died, where he's talking to some Japanese journalist about what the last scene in the French room, the bedroom, really means. He uses the language of gods. You could say that the UFO or alien experience is sort of like, Eric Von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods? You know what I mean? But I think that there's something more going on. And certainly Carl Jung, which I'm going to get to, Carl Jung, before he died in the early 60s, he wrote that book about the flying saucer phenomenon. And he realized that it was an archetypal manifestation that this is where man was going to go in the future. That the language of the collective unconscious that is, filled with gods and goddesses and archetypes and iconotypes and symbols and images that have carried with us in every civilization throughout the globe, that all of a sudden, because we live in a highly technological postmodern society where nothing matters, man, that we don't believe in anything anymore except for our own omnipotent power over nature, except for our own, whatever you want to call it, liberal democracy or whatever, which doesn't exist, by the way. Not that if it even existed, it would be desirable, but you know what I mean. Our pretensions to higher civilization, where we decouple away from what sustained humanity and what sustained Western civilization for millennia. Carl Jung said the only way, the static principle of the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the only way that static principle of the continuity of those archetypes in the human experience can be maintained is through the language of technology, through something that modern man can experience. Now, people can argue with Carl Jung to say that, well, there was UFO experiences in the ancient world, there were UFO experiences with the ancient Mayans, there were medieval paintings, or medieval tapestries, and there was Renaissance paintings that kind of allude to UFOs. Fine, whatever. But the point being is that the craze of the UFO phenomenon in the 50s and 60s that was in tandem with the New Age movement. This is what Carl Jung was saying. And this film, notice how 2001 comes out when? During the New Age movement. So it's not just a sci-fi film. It's a metaphysical film. Even though it uses language of Friedrich Nietzsche, it aims for something that is deep within Western civilization and deep within the spiritual realities of the civilization that we have built, our ancestors have built. That is what represents in Stanley Kubrick's, that was represented by Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey. So let's talk a little bit more about the Nietzschean element. Then I'm going to get into like the eternal return and so forth. So this is from an article by Deep Insight and Otto Gross, Nietzschean physician, psychoanalyst. So Otto Gross was he was also, I mean, there was a lot of precursors to psychoanalysis as it had been known, or rather known to us, with Jung and Freud. Arthur Grodek, Otto Gross, adulterer and notorious promoter of polygamy, was admitted to the Berkeley Psychiatric Hospital. I'm not pronouncing it right. May 1908, he was to be treated for his relentless addiction to certain substances and fell under the personal supervision of Jung himself. And of course, this is before World War I, and Jung had a lot of duties during World War I because Switzerland was a neutral country. Whereas Freud, being an old head and being, at that time, not in a position to be at the front lines, he had a lot of time to do most of his theoretical work during the war, when like a lion's share of his patients were either going off to fight or, he simply wasn't there like Jung was. Jung was, of course, young and spry, and he had frontline duties as in a neutral country. So Gross had, when still in a better condition, been a disciple of Freud and had been regarded by as many, including Freud himself, as a man of great intellect and promise. He endorsed a very radical philosophy of life, which perhaps can be best explained as a mixture of Nietzscheanism and psychoanalysis. So this is this is prepping the stage for Jung. According to Gross, Nietzsche provided the metaphors, Freud provided the technique. Psychoanalysis for him was a tool that had the ability to enable the sort of anti-moral Dionysian revolution he thought Nietzsche preached. So by the time Jung met Gross in 1908, Jung was, as you've seen above, already influenced by Nietzsche, albeit only on a philosophic level, not on a practical one. And then let's go further. So Dionysian Nietzscheanism that Gross practiced and preached, and it comes therefore as no surprise that his initial judgment of Gross's thought was one of distaste, although Jung, he had a few liaisons himself with Sabina Spiellein and so forth, but anyways. With Jung had fallen somewhat under the spell of Gross, his influence, he renewed fascination with Nietzsche and the Dionysian, is a question to which would probably never have the answer. And of course, right after this is when Jung started doing his active imagination rituals, which then culminated in the paintings and letters in his various journals that would then come out as the Red Book. The fact that both instances coincided does make this likely to be true. Gross probably functioned as a catalyst for Jung's heightened interest in Nietzsche and his concept of the Dionysian. The knowledge of Nietzsche's philosophy was already there for Jung, but Gross amplified this. So this is all biographical details. So then he wrote the famous Red Book. Jung embarked on his second reading of the work, this time making a lot of notes. Jung embarked on an even more extensive reading of the book Zarathustra. They're talking about Nietzsche's Zarathustra. That culminated into his famous lectures on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. So then his seminars or lectures, Nietzsche was increasingly being associated with certain ideology of the mid-century. So let's skip over this. So Jung's language is called for compensation. It was to try to correct conscious attitudes that are too narrow or one-sided by offering, by means of archetypal content, a compensatory alternative. Zarathustra, according to Jung, consists of such archetypal compensatory content, in which therefore a book which not only said something about Nietzsche, but also the zeitgeist of Western culture and civilization at this particular moment in history. And again, this is the 30s into the 40s. This is the mid-century. This is where Jung was trying to analyze, and it comes out in his book. What's it called? I have it right here. Civilization and Transition is where you find a lot of this. But of course, if you read Jung's lectures on Nietzsche, then you'll see what I mean. Jung labeled the process that resulted from the compensatory nature of the unconscious entheodromia, a term he borrowed from Heraclitus to denote a process of alternation between opposites. When the psychological system had reached a certain extreme, the unconscious will intervene by means of an archetypal compensation, thus causing the psychological system to change its course towards the opposite of that extreme. Jung not only saw this principle as underlying the psychological life of the individual, but as underlying the process of life itself. Quote, in this process of life and becoming, the pair of opposites come together. The idea of the next to be to the best is the worst. So if a bad thing gets very bad, it may transform into something good. This is the natural enantiodromia. And so, of course, you find this all throughout Nietzsche's Zarathustra. So Jung's seminars in Zarathustra bear out this principle. Because you have to remember, Zarathustra is coming about the way that Nietzsche came about in the 19th century as a compensatory action for the sort of, to use a Deleuzian term, the sort of like overcoding of metaphysics and the overcoding of the Western philosophic and theological tradition that was about in Germany, especially at that time. And this comes out, of course, when Nietzsche talks about Kant and of course, Christianity and Twilight of Idols, where things become so abstracted to the point of absurdity to where now you have a very similar religious figure being played out in Zarathustra, but only of the earth and of the eminent rather than transcendental. And so you see the opposite occurring again, even though people, rightfully so, people think that 2001: A Space Odyssey is a Nietzschean film. You have now the age of hyper-scientific materialism encountering beings beyond our comprehension that are of a spiritual nature once again. So, and you have a scientist becoming a sort of traveler mystic, a sojourn, a shamanic type of figure, not really of his own making. So, for example, Dr. Bowman, what does he have to do to place himself unknowingly in that threshold of transformation, where all of existence is revealed to him as the process of samsara itself, life, death, rebirth? He has to shut off Hall. Hall is the sort of overcoding and the overwrought nature of sort of human development that is purely materialistic. It is the computer system of all systems that have so thoroughly extended the human mind and human capability to where that sort of process is no longer needed. And then what comes out at the very beginning, where man is very primitive and superstitious, you have the catalyst of transformation in the Monolith. And then at the very end of the film, you have man that is highly technological, you have man that is highly materialistic, in terms of a pure philosophic use of the word materialistic, in that man is now forsaken any form of metaphysics to then reach the stars. But what do they encounter in the stars? What do they encounter at the edges of the known universe? They return back to a form of transcendence by beings that are beyond comprehension. But the only way to free the representation of man in Dr. Bowman is by destroying that very machine that is the sort of dispensator of life and death and has reached a utter limit of comprehension in terms of technical ability and digital reality, which is Hall. Hall cannot complete his mission. Its mission. It's not, but it's a male voice. But Hull cannot comprehend the contradiction of concealing the mission to the crew, the real mission, by giving them a foil, by saying, we're just going to explore this, blah, blah, blah. And so it has a life instinct, but it does not have the same moral, sentimental, and humanly capacity until its very end, when its life is threatened by being shut down by Dr. Bowman. Where he's like, I'm afraid. That's what it says. So when that process of man, which is, Dr. Bowman is the man in 2001: A Space Odyssey. That process is then accompanied once more by the catalyst of change, which is the monolith in the French room. So you have this sort of mixing of different elements here. So now reading on, and the article's almost done, but I think it really relates to what we were talking about with 2001. Jung then saw Zarathustra not as a conscious, deliberate construction of Nietzsche. Rather, he saw it as a result of a sort of dream state into which Nietzsche had entered. Well, I mean, perhaps that's a bit of projection on Jung's part, but, he did the same thing, which culminated in a work of archetypal content that stood in a compensatory relation to the age in which it had been created. Nietzsche, because he was so sensitive, was among the first sensitive young man, was the first to have such an experience, but it was Jung's conviction that the very archetypal content that had captivated Nietzsche would later enthrall all of Europe. And boy, was he right. Was Jung right? I mean, he was batting. I don't know the batting averages in baseball. I'm mostly a hockey fan, but he was batting 100 there. So what archetypal compensatory content is it that Jung claims we can find in Zarathustra? In this seminar, we find Jung claiming again and again that the essence of the book is characterized by a single archetype. And lo and behold, for those who know of anything of Jung's history, both in terms of the more mainstream interpretation of Jung, and of course, people that have tried to attack Jung over the years, it's coming, this was going to come. But it was Jung's conviction, the very archetypal content that had captivated Nietzsche would so later enthrall Europe, and that archetype is Wotan. Of course. Who else would it be? Who else would it be? So, in the summary for Jung claiming again and again the essence of the book is characterized by a single archetype, the archetype of Wotan, or Wotan, I think it's Wotan. Wotan. Jung named this archetype after a Germanic god, who he described in another text as a god of storm and agitation, an unleasher of passion and lust for battle. Because remember, you have to realize the parallel there. When Christ said, I have come to bring you a sword, Zarathustra also has a message, but instead of that being the sort of passional nature of Christ, you have another entirely different passion that I wouldn't want to characterize Zarathustra as a message of hedonism. I think that's an often misinterpretation of what Dionysianism actually means. But of course, there is a hedonic element, but not in the modern sense. I mean, people that think that it's like a justification for modern hedonism is, I think, deeply misconstrued. Rather, the message of Zarathustra as the passional nature for overcoming of oneself, which implies a form of self-marshaling or a form of self-regulation that perhaps may break the ancient taboos of both more older versions of paganism in Europe and Christianity certainly, but that still implies something that is very ancient, which is man's overcoming. But the difference being is that in 2001: A Space Odyssey, you do have the same sense of man overcoming. But man is overcoming himself, but when he overcomes himself, unlike, let's say, both people on, in academia that interpret Nietzsche and people that have a lot of funny names and who, bodybuild and do things on the internet, I think they both sort of miss what could potentially come out of that transvaluation of values, of self-overcoming, of overcoming the structures of both metaphysics and morality and everyday life that was built up upon continental Europe at the time. And I think that what comes at the end of that process of transvaluation is something that is still to be seen. And this is something that other religious scholars who have encountered Nietzsche, such as Mircea Eliade, whatever. I prefer Eliade, but the point being is that they would point out that there still is a debate over what comes on the other end. And a lot of people nowadays, they talk about transhumanism being part of this process, and there was this interview with the Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley, and about, he has this like weirdo Christian Nietzschean fusion, which I think is not entirely thought out, about, well, when Christ says we should perfect ourselves, then it's like, why can't we just have, body modifications and transhumanism? Why can't we expand our consciousness that way? It's, well, I don't necessarily think that that's what the church fathers meant by the perfection of oneself through the grace of the Lord. But also in terms of Nietzsche, a lot of people, this is debated in contemporary circles, not just like weirdos on the internet, but also in academia. It's debated whether the extent to which Nietzsche implied a form of physical transformation in Zarathustra, or if it was metaphorical, and the overcoming of oneself is something that is more inwardly driven and more mystical than something of like a sort of garish caricature of what an overman is, which is like, I don't know what people think when they hear the term overman. They think of like a half technology, a half robotic, like Frank Frazetta illustration of a man. You know what I mean? It's like Conan the Barbarian, but what if Conan the Barbarian was like a AI, or what if Conan the Barbarian was transhumanist? Like, that's basically what people think when they think of the overman. But really, I think even Nietzsche said this somewhere. I know for a fact that certain professors have actually said this. One, I went to school with a Nietzsche expert, and he was one of my professors, and we did a whole grad course in Zarathustra, and he said, a Tibetan monk that achieves liberation is an overman. So really think about that, because I understand that it's to get over the sort of meekness element of what the perfected being in Christianity is, in apostolic Christianity, which is something that Nietzsche balked at. But I think that modern fanboys of Nietzsche have really gone too far in sort of ascribing this sort of steppe warrior barbarism ethic to what Nietzsche was trying to get at, especially in Zarathustra. I think that these things have a sensitivity to them. And to relate it back to 2001, is Dr. Bowman an overman? Is he a Giga Chad? Is he, or rather, is he put in an impossible position where he becomes part of that catalytic, cataclysm could potentially be a word, but that catalyst for transformation. Dr. Bowman, in a sense, is an everyman. But he is an everyman of a highly technologically advanced and scientifically based society that is encountering something that is beyond. But so let's keep reading on. It's almost done. So, Jung named the archetype as Germanic god who described in another text, god of storm and agitation, unleasher of passion and lust for battle, as well as a sorcerer and master of illusion, who is woven into all secrets of occult nature. Well, I mean, hey, that's 2001 to a T. Because in a way, like, some people have debated the role of Hall in 2001. And you could say that in some ways, Hall is sort of like a low-key type of trickster archetype, that he is sort of, the computer program is sort of mindlessly following a prerogative that is revealed to be the sort of zenith of human achievement. But in actuality, a computer cannot still understand paradox. A computer can rely on elaborate trickery, can even redact the crew members, to fulfill a mission that the program itself does not understand. But when it comes down to it, real human spirit conquers this sort of like phantasm of human ingenuity and intelligence. And I think that's what a lot of people that are very transfixed with AI nowadays, and this is really, I think, a good message of, not to say that Stanley Kubrick is like an anarcho-primitivist or something like that, or he has sort of like an anti-tech message. It's deeper than that, but I think that the over-reliance on this sort of like post-scarcity, tech-driven society producing these modern marvels really is underlined when the sort of rubber meets the road of when that intelligence, that is a created intelligence rather than organic intelligence, when that is tested, you have, man-made horrors beyond your comprehension, right? Because there was people that commented on that one scene with the crew members in cryostasis. That little spike in their heart integers before they pass on. Really, when you think about it, that's, even though they're sort of like kind of expiring in their sleep, they're not really. Their lives are being held not by grace, not by fate, not by battle, not by old age. They are literally being wiped away by a creation of man's own hand. Not in the way a gun is, not in the way a missile is, not in the way, faulty medical equipment can lead to such things. But it's terrifying, and it's deeply instinctually terrifying, as people were saying, and if you go to YouTube, you go to the clip of this, people were saying that it's terrifying on a level like no other horror movie. Like, it's not like a zombie's eating your face, and you're screaming and panicking. It's not like some kind of like gore corn film, like Hostel or Saw series or whatever. There's something very instinctually off about just slipping away into oblivion that isn't induced by old age or by the hand of battle or by another means. It's an alien technology that, not alien in the sense of otherworldly, but rather alien to the human person encountering something that is a dispensator of life and death. And I think that's what the real cosmic horror of 2001: A Space Odyssey is. It's not just being in the midst of encountering beings that are beyond your comprehension, but unleashing technologies that in actuality are beyond your comprehension and beyond the comprehension, if there is such a thing in AI, of the actual program or machine or robot or whatever you want to call it, computer program itself. So there's a huge chain of unknowing. And so I think in 2001: A Space Odyssey is an ultimate, not necessarily morality tale, but certainly a tale of mankind, in demonstrating that when you do achieve a sort of crisis point or singularity point into the next level, then you are met with something very ancient. You are met with the monolith. You are met with a catalyst of transformation, when the sort of pretension of maturity and rationality in our civilization, in that civilization that Kubrick was predicting, being highly technologically advanced and so forth. When our pretensions are wiped away because we have multiple levels of unknowing. We do not know the things that we are creating, or rather we don't know their full implications. We like to think that we're more rational than we are. We like to think that we're more clever and more in control of nature and the cosmos than we actually are. And so it's almost like what Heraclitus said. It's like reality is like children playing draughts on a table, knocking them over. Draughts are like a form of chess, right? And so 2001: A Space Odyssey is this demonstration of when man can create things that are beyond our comprehension, or rather we think are not beyond our comprehension, but rather they are, then the monolith will reappear. When we have overcoated ourselves towards one thing, there always will be a compensation. And so this is why I think it's pertinent to bring Zarathustra and Carl Jung's interpretation of Zarathustra into analyzing 2001: A Space Odyssey. So here he says, it is Wotan who gets him, the old wine god breaking forth, the god of inspiration, of madness, of intoxication, and wildness, the god of the berserkers, those wild people who run amok. Now, that's very pertinent to Zarathustra. This archetype first revealed itself in the work of Nietzsche, but has, by the time of the seminar, already captivated almost everyone in Europe. And what happens right after this? Okay, he wrote this in 1934. 34, 44, 55, 56. So you wait a few decades, right? And what do you have? You have the New Age movement. You have an explosion of Dionysianism. Now, old Wotan is in the center of Europe. You can see all of the psychological symptoms which he has personified. Fascism in Italy is old Wotan again, is Germanic blood down there. And of course, Jung never totally denounced certain regimes, but he had to like sort of psychoanalyze them and gave them a somewhat negative interpretation, which I think is kind of like a better way of doing it. I think, sort of like just, doing this whole mea culpa thing is, well, that's besides the point. He famously said that the Austrian painter had very feminine handwriting, was very careful and feminine. I don't know why. I think that Jung just did that to be like, just to, kind of deflect from the fact that he still took lectures there, because he knew he didn't want to really make enemies because of the Psychoanalytic Society having certain perceptions. And I'll leave it at that. I think, Jung was not in the business of making political enemies. Whereas other, like, more crazier people either directly confronted the fascists in Italy and Germany, or in the case of other people such as Evola, directly confronted them from a right-wing position as opposed to a left-wing position. And so I wouldn't really want to... certain I shouldn't say biographers, I should say certain muckrakers who have gone against Jung, such as that one book, what was it called? Jung and the Return of an Aryan God, that tried to like denigrate Jung and say he didn't denounce them hard enough. I think that you can't really place moral responsibility on academics in Europe at that time. I mean, some people can, as much as I admire and follow a lot of his work, I think the better case could be made with Heidegger, because of course Heidegger never denounced his affiliations and was an active supporter. I'm just saying, like, in all fairness, it's safe to assume that Heidegger definitely probably does have some moral culpability there. But when it comes to Jung, it's just not, it's absurd. It's a hit piece. It's a hit piece. Jung was only tangentially on the periphery, and he was not nearly involved in that certain regime the way that other academics were. And so to like place blame on Jung for psychoanalysis and the academy and the future of psychoanalysis not being thoroughly ensconced in progressive ideology retroactively, it's just, to me, is absurd. Even people that don't want to read like Carl Schmitt and Heidegger because of their affiliations, to me, is just absurd. Like, Heidegger in terms of Western philosophy as a whole, Carl Schmitt in terms of political philosophy. Obviously two giants that have quote-unquote problematic, obviously problematic linkages. But to say I'm never going to read their work and their work is totally worthless because of it, that's an absurdity. But what's even more of an absurdity is to like blame Jung for, doing a few lectures in Germany at the time. And anyways, so that's a little side note. I don't know, I have an innate impulse to defend Carl Jung, but I think a lot of the charges that have been made against him, and there are papers that were actually written by Jung societies that were counteracting a lot of those books, such as that one. I believe it's called Jung and the Rebirth of an Aryan God or something like that. It was like essentially a huge hit piece against Jung in academic form. But anyways, what are you going to do? On the considering quote from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which sums up Jung's thoughts on the relationship between Wotan, Nietzsche, and the disasters of war quite well. And this is from, well, it was published in 1965, but he died in 1962. So he wrote this in 1961. The Dionysian experience of Nietzsche might better be ascribed to the god of ecstasy, Wotan. The hubris of the Wilhelm era aligned Europe and paved the way for the disaster of 1914. In my youth, I was unconsciously caught up in the spirit of the age. So there you go. Jung is, of course, a very old Jung at this time, is reflecting on his role in the whole thing. Both quotes illustrate very clear that Jung saw the archetype of Wotan as an explanatory cause for both World War I and fascism. The second quote, however, well, I wonder, I mean, Jung also had things to say about communism too, but, I mean, this is more of mainstream articles, so, you know. The second quote, however, also illustrates something that is of much more importance to our discussion here. Jung related Wotan directly to the Dionysian. Indeed, when we examine Jung's discussion of Wotan in the seminar on Zarathustra, he makes explicit the fact that he considers the two related. Therefore, one can say he, Wotan, is very similar to the Thracian Dionysio, the god of orgiastic enthusiasm. Now we finally come full circle, as we have seen in the very first section of this article. The work of Nietzsche that Jung most interested in was Zarathustra, and the Nietzschean concept he found the most important was the Dionysian. Here then do these two strands finally come together. Zarathustra, according to Jung, was an archetypal work that stood in compensatory relationship to the Apollonian age in which it was created. And the archetype which characterized it most of all was the archetype of Wotan, or in non-Germanic terms, Dionysio, or Dionysius. In my youth, Jung wrote in the passage from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, quote, I was unconsciously caught up in the spirit of the age. We can now finally come to understand what he meant by this. According to Jung, his age was characterized by the spirit of Wotan, or in Nietzschean terms, the spirit of Dionysius. And it was in Zarathustra that he saw this spirit announce itself after having been neglected for such a long time during the overtly Apollonian era of Christianity. Zarathustra, in other words, was the Dionysian experience par excellence. This conclusion says another topic to discuss is what is meant by the Dionysianism of Nietzsche. This is a topic of its own, which I do not have room to fully do justice. It's also a topic about what the scholars who have written about Jung's reception of Nietzsche disagree somewhat. For myself, I am coming to the conclusion that the concept from Jung's own theoretical framework, which was most explicitly influenced by Nietzsche, is his concept of the shadow. What is Hall in 2001? He is the shadow self of humanity that must be shed. My shadow shedding skin. I know Tool is kind of like one of those like what stupid people think smart people listen to type of bands. But no, that the lyric from 46 and 2 is pretty apt, right? My shadow shedding skin. Jung hypothesized that all of the inferior parts of ourselves, and this is Jung's term, of course the writer has to it's not me saying inferior. How dare I be negative about anything? Hypothesis that all the inferior Jung's term part of ourselves which we refuse presence in our lives, our wild and untamed instincts, as well as our unethical character traits and ideas, take on a subconscious life of their own, occasionally overtaking us when we least suspect it. According to Jung, the best way to deal with the shadow side of our personality is not to deny it, but to become conscious of it and work with it. The shadow, in other words, is not to be neglected, it is to be confronted. When this task is accomplished, the shadow stops being antagonistic and can even become a source of great strength and creativity. The shadow, in other words, must be integrated into the conscious personality. It is a therapeutic necessity. So after was neglected and repressed in Christian era, operates at a primitive emotional level, this is the Dionysian, is also the source of vitality and inspiration, a congenial asset. This is what Jung wrote in 1918, which represents the spirit of true life. And of course, he writes this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So then he develops Nietzsche's idea of Zarathustra. Nietzsche's idea has a strong influence on the way his own concept took shape. Understanding Jung's relationship to the extraordinary German thinker is therefore of prime importance for anyone who wants to truly understand Jung himself. So here's a few tidbits, though, I think. Then I'll relate it back to 2001. One is the role of Christianity. Now, we can't really conceive of this, I mean, especially if you are a listener of sort of like the Gen X and millennial persuasion, who have lived through the new atheist movement, for example. The assertion that Christianity was a form of Apollonianism would be absurd, right? But not really. It's not really absurd. If you actually read Nietzsche, and you actually read the more, the better, less overtly atheistic, criticisms of Christianity from, from like various other types of sects like Buddhism, pagans, so forth, or more charitable accounts of a critique of Christianity, you would realize that at a time from medieval Europe till about the 19th century, Christendom was sort of a very Apollonian ordering force. It was a rationalistic force. That doesn't make sense to us because we have this like media depiction of what Christianity is. A lot of, especially like, not so young people anymore, but let's say Gen Xers and millennials growing up in North America, or more secular societies in Europe, have this like very weird and anachronistic interpretation of what Christianity and Christendom, when Christianity was the main force of structure within Western civilization. We have a very like skewed picture of what Christianity actually is and was. Because, as Nietzsche points out, Christianity is an Apollonian force. It is not what a lot of current popular media depicts as a form of irrationality, in sort of like the popular media depiction of the crazed pastor, evangelical, or the bigoted Catholic priest. It's always a Catholic priest, or the Catholic priest confronting some form of evil. Because even though America is a Protestant nation, the sort of main, for a variety of reasons, which I mean is beyond the scope of this podcast episode, but for a variety of reasons, the Catholic priest becomes synonymous with Christianity as a whole, and the default towards especially in the horror genre, to which you could say like The Exorcist and so forth is slotted in, the Catholic priest becomes this archetypal image. But there's also a form of confronting either the beyond, in which case a lot of horror, despite modern interpretations of horror and very politically motivated productions by certain directors, horror historically, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's like a pro-traditionalist or whatever type of genre of popular media, but certainly has a lot of undertones that leads itself towards confrontations with things that are beyond the scope of modern materialism and rationality as such. And that's like basically the whole crux of a lot of horror. For example, the recent 20 Years Later film is an incredible tale. An incredible tale of memento mori and of a son overcoming the moral failings of his weak father and trying to redeem his dying mother. It's an incredible film. If someone wants to pay me to review all 3 of the 20 series of films, 28 Days Later is my favorite film as a kid. And if you want to drop me, my usual fee for a film review like this one is $100, but I will give you 3 for the price of 1. I will do this. But anyways, so Christianity was conceived historically as an Apollonian force, as a force not just of a moral order that is stringent, that has a very clear logic. Because Thomism, for example, has a very clear logic in terms of morality. A lot of it cribbing from Aristotle, ethics, and so forth. But Christianity, when people call it, especially, here's the thing, it's not just that Nietzsche is critiquing the sort of moral constraints of Christianity in favor of a Dionysianism. That's one part of it. It is that Christianity, to Nietzsche, is an overcoating of rationality. It is rationality that has created a very Baroque, very Byzantine type of system that was undergirded by Western metaphysics. And by the time you get to Kant in the Second Critique and the Categorical Imperative, where rationality becomes the engine of all perception, not just, well, it's what provokes the faculties of the understanding to sort the sensuous data of the outside world into a coherent whole. But to Nietzsche, and of course rationality reason itself must imply a noumenal realm, a realm of forms. I mean, people debate what if Kant meant the realm of forms, but let's say from Plato to Kant there is a through line. From Plato and Aristotle to Descartes to Kant, one thing that catalyzes the moral order based on reason, on logos, is the mass adoption of Christianity to Nietzsche. And but then of course, there still is the mystical heart there, which I think Nietzsche vastly underplays in a lot of regards, to which Jung would then later rediscover. Because Jung had a very and he says a lot of things that are kind of like, I would guess, modernist, you could say nowadays. Like, for example, in his letter on the Catholic Church, I read this with my friend Scott Manion. It's like, it comes off as kind of modernist and like, he had a New Age bias or whatever. But when it comes to Christianity and Jung, of course, greatly struggled with the question of Christianity because he realized its archetypal power, but his father was a Lutheran pastor, and he sort of drifted from an orthodox, I don't mean like Orthodox Christianity, I mean like a more, how should I say it, a more orthodox rather than a heterodox interpretation, a more proper interpretation of Christianity, to venture off into a form of like weird Christian Gnosticism that, for example, the scholar of Jung, Stephen J. Hollier, comments upon in, for example, Jung and the Lost Gospels, Jung and the Gnostic Christ, and so forth. So Jung has this contentious relationship with Christianity, but he doesn't go so far as Nietzsche, because he realizes the place of the balance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Whereas Nietzsche says the Dionysian element of Christianity, the rational ordering of Christianity, is basically what has led to a fin de siècle, the sickness of the century. But Jung realizes that because of this sort of a causal principle of compensatory power, Jung realizes that the age will reveal itself in its other in a very dramatic way when one element goes totally overboard. And you could say that Christianity, before Nietzsche's thesis of the death of God, went too far into the Apollonian, by which I mean Western Europe and then later North America and certain parts of the Middle East and so forth. Whereas in Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe, it's kind of different. There definitely is that Apollonian element, but I think, Nietzsche didn't have, I don't think, a lot of business with Orthodox Christianity as opposed to Lutheranism and Catholicism. Lutheranism is very interesting because, especially in Germany at the time, it was like the most rationalistic version of Christianity you could find. Whereas, for example, certainly Catholicism in places, well, maybe not so much in Ireland, but certainly in Italy, left room for a lot of the passional, left room for a lot of the sensuous, left room for the aesthetic. Whereas Lutheranism at that time was very hard-nosed. And so that is the type of Germanic Christianity that Nietzsche was responding to, that goes all together with the Western tradition. But it's very interesting to relate it back to 2001: A Space Odyssey. You have man becoming fully secularized. You have the total abandonment of the moral order of Christendom. You have a new cosmic order of awareness. Up until, except for barring the first part, at the ascent of human consciousness in the first scene, you have a thoroughly secular, science-driven society. You have a return to an even more restrictive version of reason and an even more restrictive version of Apollonianism, to where man can reach the stars but be totally ignorant of the implications of such things, because they take that sort of mindset along with them of man ordered against nature, or rather over nature, and over the cosmic hierarchy itself. And so 2001: A Space Odyssey tries to rectify this by saying that in a time of great overcoding of the the Apollonian, tongue tied right there, Freudian slip, at the very edges of the cosmos, you will get the Dionysian once more. You will get the rebirth of the cosmic child. You will go through, which we will explore more in depth in a few minutes, you will get the threshold of transformation that is the Heliophany. And I'll explain what that means in the Messiah Eliade term, Heliophany. The space of the sacred, the space and threshold of transformation. By the way, I highly recommend that song by the band Isis, Thresholds of Transformation. But you get in that room a sort of weird depiction of looking at man from the position of these cosmic beings, looking at the life cycle of man. Bowman is prematurely aged. There are different versions of him at different times of his life to then go through that rebirth. He is in an observatory. He is in a human zoo, which used to exist, by the way. He is in a petri dish of life, death, rebirth. But it is a sort of grand irony of 2001 that when man thinks that they have reached the absolute height of rationality, of the Apollonian element, where we can conquer the stars and we can discover the real essence and creation of the world, of humankind, of the universe itself. At that moment, when we try to rationalistically explain things, and we bring our sort of weird tulpa along with us, that then turns against us, being Hall, artificial intelligence, then you have beings beyond comprehension, beyond measure, that remind us of the real cosmic hierarchy and order. And that is the lesson of 2001. And, well, there's more lessons than that, but that is certainly a huge element. It is an odyssey of mankind exploring mankind's own shadow self that we have projected, and exploring the very limits of a civilization that has totally invested itself in one element over the other. But that other element is always lurking in dark space, in dark matter, to be confronted with. So let's take a little bit of a break, and we'll come back with the thesis of the Heliophanies of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I'll promise I will explain in depth what a Heliophany is by the great scholar, religious scholar and philosopher, one of the best Romanian philosophers of all time, Mircea Eliade. So, yeah, take it away. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every content-minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.